Good evening, Dr. Poloski. This is probably like take 13 by now, I think. But as you know, I'm here to talk to you about T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, one of the most pivotal poems written in literary history, especially within our time, and how it relates to one of the stories that we've read in class, and essentially how it gives allusions and relates to world literature as a whole. This poem especially delves into every sort of piece of literature from so many different cultures and regions, and reading the footnotes harks on to things that I have never read and I didn't even know. But it does give allusions to Shakespeare, The Tempest. It talks about Cleopatra and Mark Antony. It gives good shout outs to different religious traditions, such as explaining about, St. Augustine, and it gives a good depiction of the fire trials within Buddhism, and which correlate as well into Hinduism, which he later talks about the Upanishad tradition and the Vedas that they follow and base their rituals upon. So I'm going to get right into comparing T.S. Eliot's Wasteland to Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. Obviously, the most direct correlation is between these two pieces. As you said, Eliot is very influenced by Conrad at this time, and it kind of shows. And it shows in a way that I wouldn't have noticed directly, or something that's not so overt, but I see it in the form and structure, and their importance that they place on form and structure in literature and just in thinking in general. This starts with, we see Conrad talking, Conrad talking within the Heart of Darkness about the cracked nut, and how he talks about the outside structure is essentially what forms the inside structure. So let's just go to the passage here. Well, we'll skip some part, but Marlowe was not typical. If his propensity to spin yarns be expected, and to him, meaning of an episode was not inside like a kernel, but outside, enveloping the tale, which brought it out only as a glow, bringing out the haze, like the likeliness of one of these misty halos that sometimes are made visible by the spectral illusion of moonshine. So here we see Conrad talking about the structure of things. It's not so much the story itself that he tells that is important, but it's the way that it's structured, the way that he tells it, that gives meaning to the overall message of this story. It's not essentially getting straight to the point, but it's all of the, if you will, frills and excitement that he adds to it that really gives the story its message and its propensity. And then here in Elliot, we see the same thing with his form and structure, because Elliot, in his time, completely deviated from what the form and structure was and what the reader expected. Elliot used fragments and just this incontinuous transition within his poems that left the reader kind of looking for their own, where his segments started and where they stopped. And what it did for him was it tricked the reader. And I feel like for him, essentially spoke to a audience of higher mentality, which is what I think he was looking for in his audience, but gave them not an essential way to break down his poem, but it made them look at the overall message and story of his poem, rather than seeing his pieces for individual clout. They took those pieces and had to piece them together in order to get that same culminating message that he meant to spread, which is very interesting. especially to know at the time when he wrote this poem that he was in a state of, discord. World War I had just ended, and that shaped and changed the way everyone looked and viewed everything, especially literature. So when he was writing The Wasteland, he was essentially making it a reflection of the world condition at the time. The Wasteland depicts this barrenness, this desolation of society. And that's exactly what he was going through at the time and what everyone was going through. And Conrad took that experience and those worldviews and completely changed what it meant to write, completely changed the structure of poetry at the time, and used it as a essentially parallel to what was going on in society. One thing that Elliot does really well is allude to different and many works throughout history. Many influential works that are not only Western, such as Shakespeare, of course, Conrad. He goes through Wagner a lot, operatic, an opera, and draws from that Greek mythology, plenty. But he as well draws from religion and many different religions, which is very interesting that for someone of his cultural influence, I would say someone from the West at his time, to hark and allude to Eastern religion is very interesting. At this time, these religions would be very heretic to these people and to his readers, and just very foreign and more philosophical, if anything. And I believe that's what he used them as. He harks on the Buddha's fire ritual, which within Hinduism, which branched to Buddhism, fire is a form of creation and a form of rebirth. Within the Upanishads, who he speaks of, they had the fire rituals of yajna, in which they would set people on fire, and then from this rebirth would come the essence of Brahma, the ultimate creator. And it's very interesting in that he would use the Buddha's, he uses the Buddha's fire principle or fire meditation, which I'm not familiar with in its own structure, but let's look at where it comes from here. Well, it's very interesting because within Buddhism, these fire rituals and these rebirths within fire were actually something that was seen, I wouldn't say barbaric, but something that was seemed violent. And Buddhism actually phased out these fire rituals. But when it comes to the Buddha's fire sermon, is what we spoke of. This fire sermon that the Buddha speaks of is the key aspect of where the Hindus came from it. But instead of giving this fire sacrifice, the Buddha speaks of fire being of cleansing and rebirth. And this fire sacrifice shows something coming from the ashes of destruction, which is essentially where we're at here. We're trying to rebuild society from the ashes of the destruction of this massive world war that was something that's never been seen on our planet before. So that's very interesting. And he harks into different religions such as Christianity, Catholicism, paralleling the Buddha's fire sermon to the Sermon on the Mount, in which Moses went, gave a sermon from the burning, brought down the Ten Commandments, gave the sermon, am I confusing that with Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount? Western religion's not my thing. I know some about it, but it's not my big thing. Eastern religion's where I like. But in a sense, T.S. Eliot gave a very different and I feel broadly viewed perspective of the world's crisis and turmoil of the time. We, like I hark back to, we just went through World War One, the biggest, most catastrophic war that the world has ever seen on this large global scale. And when you see something like this, you try to think of, where does society pick up from here? What was society prior to this? And that it made them go into this direction. It's a comprehensive statement, essentially, about world literature in itself. As to where it was, essentially, world literature was a safe structure of telling tales, essentially. It told tales in many different ways. We see myth. We see even Conrad using his structure of the Heart of Darkness with this frame narrator in order to try to recreate and harken back to the oral tradition, trying to bring back that sense of, I would like to say, I'm not sure, that's this sense of importance in perpetuating tradition or perpetuating information that was important for the human condition. That's why he used his frame narration in order to give Marlowe, who may have been an unreliable narrator, credibility in his own experience of seeing slavery firsthand in a world that we have thought was done with it. Depicting a trade that was very barbaric in itself and showed the atrocities of consumerism. And we have Elliot, who comes with the Wasteland and continues on those coattails and provides us with a firsthand, or not a firsthand, but provides us with a very symbolic and intuitive description of the atrocities of the world, of society, and the desolation